So my buddy found this old motor when he was cleaning out his garage one day and ended up giving it to me. And so I tested it out, make sure that it still worked, and it did. It also came with this pulley attachment that mounted to the crankshaft. So I decided to use this piece as sort of a mounting bracket for the disc sander. So I took it over to the drill press and put some holes in it so that some wood screws could fit through and mount it to the sanding disc. I then just used a piece of plywood scrap for the disc, which I drew a 12-inch circle on, and then used a bandsaw to cut it out, which you could easily just use a hacksaw too. But make sure you cut as closely to the line as possible so that the disc won't be off balance a little bit later. But I then marked some screws with a screwdriver, then made some pilot holes, and finally attached the pulley attachment to the sanding disc, which I then mounted back onto the motor to see how it would run. And it really ran pretty well. It didn't have too much vibration, but I'll try and reduce that a little bit later after I make the whole base assembly. And to do that, I started by cutting out a piece of plywood with a jigsaw, and then cut some legs for a table that will lift the motor off of the base. And I just dry assembled everything to make sure it was how I wanted, and then used some wood screws to fasten everything together. I then used a square to make sure that the disc was perpendicular to the table, and then traced some holes for mounting the motor to the table, which I drilled out, and then just used some bolts I had laying around to mount the motor to the table. And so once it was mounted, I then took some measurements and used a scrap piece of MDF for the tabletop where I'd actually be sanding pieces on. And you'll want to get the table as close to vertical to the center of the disc as possible. Here I'm just cutting off some legs for the table out of 2x4s. Then I clamped everything together in place and used some wood screws to secure it together. And then once the legs were secure, I then used a skew chisel to true up the disc and mitigate some of that wobble and vibration you saw at the with the initial test. Then I just attached the sanding pad to the disc. I picked this one up at Harbor Freight for a few dollars, but I'm sure you can find some otherwhere. And then I started to assemble the tabletop. Now you'd be fine with stopping right here and using the disc sander as is, but I decided to make a guide for my miter gauge by adding another layer on top of the table and leaving a gap for the miter gauge to fit in. And so I cut a second strip of that top layer and attached it at the right distance from the first one so that the gauge would fit nice and tight. And I just lucked out that I had a piece of plywood that was 1/8 inch thick, so the gauge would fit flush with the tabletop. And here's the first test run with a piece of just 2x4 scrap I had laying around. It works very nicely. It's definitely going to come in handy in the future.
Wraps it up. I have a 12-inch disc sander from either free or scrap parts, and it's a really nice addition to any workshop, really. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section down below. And if you like these types of tutorial videos, be sure to subscribe so you know when I post the next one. And thanks again for watching. I appreciate it. See you next time.